Hello team and welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MS Pearce. This is a very late frontline update for the Ukraine war from me. It's been a day that I've been waiting for more data to come out from the frontline, but actually not a lot has come out. I was going to say not a lot has changed. I can't at all have any confidence in saying that. But it appears that there's either a lot of operational security going on. As I always say, it's either operational security or things are pretty tough and there's not a lot of movement on the front lines because it's grinding and attritional, or a mixture of both of those. But let's go and see what has happened. Some of this data is coming from sort of the end of yesterday's play that I went through with you this morning, and it hasn't really changed, so I'll re-go over that. And a few little nuggets to throw in as well. We're looking at the northeast sector going up and down here. There doesn't seem to be too much to report from there. It's interesting listening to Andrew Perpetua's live stream saying that the hottest area on the front line is that Novohayarivka sector near Karmazianivka. We'll go there in a second. But in the meantime, please check out the map legend here as to what is going on my maps, on my map, what each of the lines mean, the different colours. Pause the video if you want to know. Right, so talking about the northeastern sector, this is from Kupiansk up here to Svatova to Kreminna there. We're going to zoom into Svatova, and this area, Karmazianivka, Novohayarivka is a small village that they are tussling over at the moment. And Perpetua was saying that this is the hottest area of the front line outside of basically Robotina, really. He said it's just an awful lot of shelling going on around here. Just waiting for that to render Novohayarivka there. An awful lot of shelling going on in this area. It really is sort of tough there. And this northeastern sector, there's been some news reports talking about how costly it is for the Ukrainians to hold on here, but they seem to be doing quite a good job. Well, you know, at what cost? Doing quite a good job of holding the Russians off without committing their resources from the counteroffensive. Let's see what Kenneth Runt has to say. By the way, at the end of this, Kenneth Gregg, actually, it's not Kenneth Runt. He's the one that reports what Kenneth Gregg says. At the end of this frontline update, I'm going to give you the Bryn Tannehill analysis that I promised to do this morning. Anyway, Kenneth Gregg, the Finnish fighter in Russia, take this with a pinch of salt, as always. Now we start to see the results of the last 2 days of work of our armed forces. The Russians had sent real reinforcements to Verbove and Novopokrovka, so this is going to go a bit all over the place. I know I've started in northeast, but we'll just see his general summary of everything. This did not scare our people, but we deployed kamikazes and precision artillery. As a result, the Russian convoys with both manpower and equipment were severely depleted, and then we then deployed our infantry after our small spearhead groups had conducted reconnaissance and knocked out some Russian bunkers. Inland, we advanced north towards both Novopokrovka, where we are now fighting in the northern parts of the town, and on the outskirts of Verbove, where we liberated an area of 2 by 3.5 kilometers. And also extended the grey zone by 600 meters. The distance to Verbove is now only 2 kilometers. After Verbove, all Russian defense lines have been penetrated, and the road is free to take the Russians in the back, both north and south. Also at Bakhmut, we have successes. The Russians' Akhmat reinforcements are getting grumpy as they are losing men and equipment. So those are the Chechen special forces that seem to be everywhere and nowhere. In addition, our drones are now operating inside the Bakhmut itself. And within a few days, we will probably see an extra push through Klishchivka and the surrounding area. I can't talk to any of the claims he's making there. There have been talks about if we do go down to Bakhmut, so not too much to report in that northeastern sector. If we do go down to Bakhmut, there have been claims that the Russians have an ammunition advantage here, and they do have a number of drones as well. It's not like it's all Ukrainian drones. There are complaints that the Russians have good deal of these, but it's really difficult to make claims, and this goes for both sides, for both Ukraine and Russia, to make claims about the whole front line that pertain to the whole front line. So you make a claim about what's going on in Klishchivka, and it's going to be completely different to what's going on in Robotina. And then you make a claim about Klishchivka, and that'll be completely different as to what's going on in north of Bakhmut. And so there are these little pockets of activity that have their own kind of ecosystem and their own context, where the Russians might be doing X and the Ukrainians doing Y, or each side might be having this challenge or that challenge. It's just not applicable like 20, 30, 40, 100 kilometers down the road. And so it's really difficult to say the Russians are X and the Ukrainians are Y very often. It is that variable. But anyway, as for Bakhmut itself, what resources are there to talk about? Well, Suryat Maps had this, but this is like a day old, and even then I think they were just catching up by saying, yes, Andriivka, there have been some gains for the Ukrainians there. The question is, how far do these gains now go? Are the Ukrainians, in some meaningful way to the east of the railway track that's been acting as this barrier? How much presence do they have there? Is this just contested by more ranged equipment like mortars and pushing the Russians back, but the Ukrainians aren't there themselves? I don't know at the moment. It's kind of, we'll see. And there's been talk about the Ukrainians having some success in the Ozerivka area, and it looks like, according to at least Andrew Perpetua's analysis of the shelling, that success might coincide with this shelling. So it could be here. We were talking yesterday about whether the success of Ukrainians was here, closer to Ozerivka, or between there and Kodiamivka, or indeed up here. And actually, I think that Perpetua is probably right that it's down here. We'd seen that they're pushed there sometime previously as well. So there is that too. So it turns out that just as I was looking at this map, I realized I hadn't updated the deep state map yellow line for today. So in the last 24 hours, actually, there's been some significant gains for the Ukrainian, as according to Deep State Map. I'd say that's catching up with what Andrew Perpetua is already telling us. I mean, the good thing, you know this already, most of you, but Andrew Perpetua does shelling analysis. So he'll tell you news that's irrespective of whether A or B source is saying whatever on the internet, and his contacts as well. He can look at objective data and say, well, that's happened. Well, they're definitely there because they're being shelled there. So he will move his lines, I think, before most other mappers, because they rely on sources telling them stuff. And that obviously is not sometimes not as quick as just looking at satellite imagery, as long as that satellite imagery is timely and you can see through, there are no clouds and whatnot. So here, Andrew Perpetua's had for some time lines that maybe look like what Deep State is getting towards. But now this whole area here that Deep State had under Russian control, that Russian control has now been pushed back towards a railway line here and pretty much out of the whole of Klishchiivka bar, this very kind of northeastern area there. So that is a move on the map there in Ukraine's favor, but it's nothing we didn't know. They have been struggling, the Russians in Klishchiivka, to the point where, this is one of the Ukraine's better successes on the front line, and has led people like Perpetua to say that actually this would be a really good place if you could throw in some seriously tooled up brigades. You could actually break through here now. The Russians are not in a good place and they've been attrited over time. It's a good opportunity to break through to this next line of defense there and even beyond. But whether the Ukrainians have anything like that in mind is something we don't know at the moment. They probably do have troops in the area. Whether they would want to commit them to that yet, I don't know, given it's kind of like wait and see what goes on to the south. You could build up a rationale that might be a good idea, because the Russians would hate to lose Bakhmut. And if there's a major breakthrough around here, that would send them into a bit of a spin, bit of a panic, because they'd want to commit lots of forces there to stop any kind of PR disaster, which is what they've kind of already done, right? They've committed a whole bunch of reserves, reinforcements to here. They were trying to make some inroads in this northeastern sector, and they've had to apparently pull troops from down there to plug into Bakhmut, and troops then have been plugging those holes in the northeastern sector that are new troops, newly formed Russian units, probably from mobilized troops. So yeah, there is a lot of movement for the Russian troops along the front line from one place to another. Right, we're going to come down past Avdiivka. Not too much for me to report there. I don't know of too much going on there, and come on to past Mariinka, where there are these claims about Mariinka, but it doesn't seem to be true at all, as far as what some have claiming about that tank that got behind Ukrainian lines. There was no real control changes of the map there. We're going to come on to Novomykhailivka here, which is south of Mariinka. The Ukrainian army, according to Syriac maps, have made new advances in the grey zone at south of Novomykhailivka as well. Regarding Mariinka, the situation hasn't changed. Positional battles are taking place from long distances due to the lack of intact infrastructure. Ukrainian army is located in the western outskirts, but they're separated with a large area of grey zone. But anyway, Syriac maps indicates that there is some change of territory here, that the Ukrainians are now have moved forward. I don't know whether that's actually true or whether that's just a kind of like accepting that the lines are somewhat different now. Andrew Perpetua hasn't changed his lines there particularly, although there have been. Soloka is a place where the Ukrainians have pushed over the last couple of months a little bit. So there have been some moves there. Anyway, we're going to come on down now to the southern Donetsk front, and on towards the Velika Novosilka salient. You can see the gains that the Ukrainians have made since the counteroffensive. That's the difference between a white line and the Russian defensive lines. At its sort of longest, it's about 10 kilometers worth of territory. And as you can see as well, a little bit in Vuhledar, as they pushed the Russians back from Vuhledar, from these dachas to the southeast, and then pushed the Russians back to Mikhailska there. But anyway, there's quite a lot of activity apparently taking place around Novodonetsk, particularly to the west there of the town. Let's go and look at some of the sources. There's Novodonetsk there, so just to give you an idea where that is, Velika Novosilka salient. Velika Novosilka is there. Uruzhaini down here, and Novodonetsk there. So we have that area between, well, there's a triangle of settlements here that's quite important. They all kind of support each other. Novomayorska, Novodonetsk, and Kremenchik. If one goes, they all get weakened. Here we are talking about the Ukrainians having some success to the west of Novodonetsk there. Global War Monitor says Ukraine has pushed the Russians out of the area to the west of Novodonetsk. About 2.5 square kilometers has been added to liberated status. Then goes on to say actually that was improved upon throughout today. So this is some of the latest data from this afternoon, that actually 3 square kilometers has been liberated, and that area has been expanded of Ukrainian control there. So some success for the Ukrainians in that sector. And then they added just even later today, just a very small area of land to the southeast of Uruzhaini, which is that town they liberated over the last couple of weeks. We saw that crazy tank attack coming down a river. In fact, I've done another video. I'll release that tonight, tomorrow, where I just corrected myself and said, yeah, you guys are right. It seems like it was that. And actually, the tank was firing with its turret face backwards as it was driving off here. And that's what that smoke was, and this and that, accepting that my eyesight wasn't too good with that one. Anyway, some gains for the Ukrainians in that area, as according to Global War Monitor, which is to say that they've gained territory from the grey zone. It hasn't pushed the Russian defensive lines back particularly, but gains in that grey zone. Now, there are still claims that there is fighting in... I was going to try and move this map, I can't. The fighting in Zavetnya Bezhanya. I don't know, here fighting continues in Zavetnya Bezhanya. I don't know any details about that. There were claims about that previously, and then they were called into question, and then they've resurfaced. So I imagine there probably is fighting there. It's quite difficult because you've got this bridge over the river there, and that I can't imagine the Russians wouldn't have blown that up. So imagine it might be quite difficult to access there, and that's probably why the Ukrainians sort of didn't go any further and took their operational pause at that point. But they'll be trying to ford that with bridging equipment, no doubt, or not ford it, bridge it, breach it, whatever the word is. And then Rebar's a synopsis of the area for what it's worth. This is a pro-Russian source saying the enemy's activation on the right flank of Ramovka, so that's Velika Novosilka sector, started yesterday and is ongoing. 38th Brigade attacked Novodonetsk and Novomayorska from the Zolota Niva or Preshestivka line, lost 3 armoured vehicles and fell back. According to Voin DV, that's another Russian source, the AFU are not using large forces yet in their assaults, limiting themselves to mobile groups, large-scale artillery preparation, and build-up of personnel serve as a sign of an approaching offensive in this direction. So this is what we'd heard previously from others, that actually there's a build-up, or from Russians. They were worried that there is a build-up of troops in this area. And even though they've taken this operational pause and they've been refitting, and I've said, they seem to be starting back up again, according to Rebar, and I generally agree with that summary there, that by point of fact, that I don't think that they are attacking with large forces. This will be smaller groups, exactly as detailed there, but the claim that there's a build-up of personnel and that there could be a large push coming. On the left bank of the Vremika sector, Russian forces carried out artillery strikes on enemy groupings in Uruzhaini, so that's a claim that the Russians are attacking, or at least hitting them with artillery barrages, disrupting troop rotation. So that's again talking to this idea that the Ukrainians are still sort of rotating troops in the area. And that's why they've been paused for a couple of weeks there. Territorial defence detachments continue to build up in the Priyutny area, where mutual shelling has been continuing for the past few days, and near Oyivska and Malnivka, which may suggest that Ukrainian forces are preparing a coordinated attack. Quite possibly, wouldn't surprise me that that's the case, but I can't talk to the finer details of the amount of equipment lost there. Here is a bit of, there's really not a lot of detail coming out, as I've said, from most of the front line. This is just a Russian ammunition dump that's been blown up. I was just interested to see where that was. It's near Priyutny, just to see, how close that was to Ukrainian lines. So we'll geolocate. Well, we won't geolocate. Someone else has done that. Thank you very much. But we'll plug that into our map and see where the Russians have been keeping their ammunition and where it's been blown up. So that'll be supplying the Priyutny area and maybe this section here. That may or may not be flattened off here. Andrew Pepech hasn't changed that though for a couple of days, so maybe not. There are other claims from other sources that actually that's been leveled off, and an ammunition dump hit pretty close to where that front line is. Okay, let's move out of there, move to the west to Robotna, and there are claims here that slight change here, deep state map that I hadn't recorded, that might have been sort of 24 to 36 hours ago, so a little bit of improvement for the Ukrainians in pushing back the Russian line there, but generally not too much change in the last 24 hours, at least not that we can glean from open source intelligence. Here, just down the south, Andrew Perpetua has the Ukrainians pushing a little bit further and gaining some ground on this high ground that will be heavily fortified and whatnot. Just as you may remember, you've got the defensive lines coming up here, and then another one coming up there, and Verbovi opening here is where the Ukrainian troops could get in, and then behind trench lines there. So anyway, let's go and have a look to see what the sources say about this area. So as I read to you this morning, Khodakovsky from the Vostok Battalion saying that basically the Russians are, causing the Ukrainians something to think about. That at the same time, 4 enemy tanks, no confirmed information yet, and up to a platoon of infantry were taken out of action. So it's Ukrainians. Spent efforts call for continuation of the offensive, but the forces of the first wave are already running out. So the enemy is preparing to throw into the battle reserve 38th Brigade. Well, it's not evening yet. So that's to say that it's tough for the Ukrainians in the area. Then was talk of, because there had still been these claims that Robotna had been retaken by the Russians, retaken in the afternoon, and then that evening they said, no, we pulled out Robotna. There's someone was lying, and it seems to be those claiming that they'd retaken Robotna. That hadn't happened. The Russians then admitted they pulled out Robotna and moved into the hills because this was untenable as a position to try and hold, which just shows that actually, they are, on the receiving end of an offensive. So they've tried to sell that as positively as possible, but it's just untenable for them to hold because actually they don't have the forces there to be able to compete with the attacking forces. So this was Belitsky, according to him, head of the occupation administration. The Russian army tactically left this settlement because it does not seem appropriate to stay on a bare plain when there is no way to completely dig in. I mean, they were kind of dug in and it's pulled out because they were overrun by the Ukrainians. Therefore, the Russian army retreated to the hills. To the hills, I don't know. I mean, I presume they've retreated to Novoprokopivka. There is higher ground here, but then here is where the Ukrainians are trying to pressure as well. I mean, there is. If you look at the number change in the bottom right hand corner of the screen, it tells you the height of the ground here. So that's 139 meters. That's 155. So that's coming downhill. We have 148 meters there, 141, 150. So that's pretty much the same level. And then it goes up to sort of 166 also around here in different areas around here. But even then, I think the Ukrainians are pushing up into this hill area there. So I don't know really what it means about sort of run to the hills. Maybe they're just quoting a bit of Bruce Dickinson from Iron Maiden or something. I don't know. And then we have this area captured. That's actually north this way. So you need to rotate it anti-clockwise by 90 degrees. That trench network is actually this one just here between Robotina and Novoprokopivka. That's that little section there with two little antenna bits that stick up there, but you can't see them on that graphic. But that's what that is, and apparently that has been overrun. That was quite an important area. Oh, sorry, go to Perpetua's map. That's quite an important area, this, because the Russians were able to hold on to this to stop the Ukrainians from pushing down south into Novoprokopivka. But yeah, eventually the Ukrainians have been able to take control of that, and so that's possibly why there are now rumors that there's fighting in Novoprokopivka. Getty here says Ukrainians are pushing hard, very hard, breaking through the first line of defense. The advance to the second dugouts along the first line in the direction of the village of Verbove was recorded in the area of Robotina and Novoprokopivka. The armed forces of Ukraine occupied a large stronghold located at a height. This is a big job. I think that's probably the trench works that we were just talking about. Tactical movement in the direction of Vasilivka. The armed forces advance in the village of Kamyanska. So that is as we come out of here to the west in Kamyanska, and there have been these advances of the Ukrainians. I was saying this morning that Rebar had their map with the Russian line way back here. I think that's probably a mistake, but that would be very interesting if the Russians were actually further back and the Ukrainians had that much success there. Anyway, just going back to Robotina, there are rumors that Ukraine has entered Novoprokopivka. This has come out tonight. No, that's last night. Sorry. That's from late last night. Rumors that Ukraine has entered Novoprokopivka south of Robotina. So, that's leading into those claims I was talking about. And then we go on to Kamyanska here. So this was Defmon talking about, well, Kamyanska the lines were split along the river line here, with the north being controlled by Ukraine and the south by Russia. And then we have seen that change over time as the Ukrainians have pushed further and further. So here we go. They pushed in from this direction and pushed the Russians back. And there's this area. Andrew Perpetua has much more of this area as contested, as grey zone to the west of that road coming down from Kamyanska towards Vasilivka. So this area being contested, so there will be Ukrainian presence in there, no doubt, somewhere. And this is looking like an area of this Zaporizhia front line that is creating maybe a little bit more success for the Ukrainians. So be interested to see how that develops. And that's all I really have to say for the front line. Now I'm going to talk about, there hasn't been an awful lot of information coming out today. I'll just go through this analysis because I think it's useful. So this is Bryn Tannehill. Who is she, you might ask? Author of 3 books, former naval aviator, spouse, parent, harbinger of doom, personal account. But I think she might have some affiliation, I don't know, to the ISW. Anyway, multiple sources that I consider both diligent and conservative in their assessments, including DEFMON and ISW, are showing that Ukraine has reached the main trench line outside of Verbove. This deserves some discussion. So we're going to be talking about this area. Let's go and see it on Andrew Perpetua's map. So it's this area that's significant here because you've got the tank ditch that has been overcome, but I don't think, well, as of yesterday, they still hadn't got any mechanized equipment over there. They're waiting, I think, to get more control over this manned trench line coming from Verbove and then doglegging going down south towards Novopokrovka. And that's where the Ukrainians have had some success, and they're hoping to roll along the trench in both directions. So, she continues, they've made it past the initial anti-tank ditches and Dragon's Teeth. Getting past this line in force would represent a significant tactical gain, as Russia reportedly front-loaded its defences at the first of the Surovikin lines. So not only have they front-loaded their defences, I don't know if she goes on to talk about this, but there's been this claim by the Ukrainian spokespeople in the armed forces, I forget which one, saying that actually the Russians put 60% of their effort into building and defending these first lines, right? And then 20% into each of the next kind of lines. And so the idea being that if they overcome this, then it would be easier pickings to try and get through the subsequent lines of defense, because that's 60%, 20%, 20%. That's a claim from the Ukrainians. But anyway, she continues. Brigadier General Alexander Tarnevsky estimated, here it comes, had devoted 60% of its time and resources into building the first defensive line and only 20% each to the second and third lines, because Moscow had not expected Ukrainian forces to get through. Take this with a small grain of salt, as Ukraine is keen to frame information in ways that keeps Western aid flowing. But based on the Russian reactions to Ukrainians' advances around Robotyne, this does seem more plausible. Russia pulled the 76th Guards Air Assault Division from the eastern front around Klishchivka to reinforce the area around Robotyne and Verbove. These are among the best and most well-equipped troops they have. We talked quite a lot about this. The 76th has taken significant casualties throughout the war and also perpetrated the Bucha massacres. It has also seen months of fighting around Bakhmut, but it's about the best the Russians have left. In other words, they've been highly degraded, and subsequent reconstitutions of the force will lead to poor force quality as well as actually force quantity. And there are claims that, hey, it's not going to be the whole of the 76th, it will be elements thereof. But it's about the best they have left. It's one of the few capable of offensive actions besides meat wave Zerg rush. The fact that Russia would commit one of their few units left that are capable of real counterattacks that don't involve human waves of prisoners, press-gang foreigners and Mobics says a lot. The 76th will lose capability over time, and they cannot reconstitute quickly. Despite the headline in a Forbes article, it's unclear how much reserve Russia has and where, because there is near troop parity in country. Russia can pull troops from one area to defend another, as they did with the 76th. Ukraine, for its part, is throwing theirs too. We saw the first... Right, so just want to talk about this, and someone else said this today on one of my threads. I was like, yeah, exactly what I said yesterday. So when you start seeing challenges being lost, as in near to the front line and pretty much being utilized, when you're seeing Leopard 2s being utilized, then you know that actually the Ukrainians are committing pretty much their offensive forces here, right? And their reserves. Not the full brunt of it, but you're not far off, is my guess. And the Russians are committing their best troops here, right? And this is the 60% front line, that we're talking about. So really, this is, you could argue that basically the entire war is contingent on what happens here. It could be that important. And so that's why everyone's looking at this, and everyone's a little bit on tenterhooks. It's like, everyone's throwing everything at this, and it might not seem like it. There's not like massive columns of troops and huge attacks, but actually that would just be a huge waste of troops because of the massive minefields and waste of equipment. So it's all about loading in resources to very focused areas and then exploiting them if they give way. And so if this area, if they can expand control of these trenches, will this be the dam breaking, and will you see a large contingent of Ukrainian forces pour through, and then the Russians throw everything into defending that, and then that's what it all comes down to. It comes down to that, calculus as to what happens there. So we saw the first loss of the UK. I bet because I haven't read this thread yet, I said I will share it knowing that it's going to be a good thread, and I reckon I'd probably just, for the second time, preempted what she's going to say. We saw the first loss of a UK supply Challenger 2 tank yesterday near Verbovy. The crew reportedly survived. Western equipment is very good at protecting their crews, unlike the ex-Soviet stuff participating in turret toss competitions. Ukraine has been committing both experienced units and newly formed Western equipped ones to this fight at this point. They have also been allocating much of their precious artillery resources. Ukrainian artillery has parity or better in the area. So this is one of the, going back to my earlier claim, this is one of the examples where you can't extrapolate what's going on here onto the rest of the front. So I think, yes, Ukraine has artillery advantage here, and they're freely using artillery ammunition in a way that they don't elsewhere and that they're not doing elsewhere. Anyway, she continues, now that Ukraine is inside the trench, it becomes a particularly bloody affair, clearing it one bend at a time. The map below shows a zoomed in guess at the situation, but mines become less of a factor once you've cleared a path to the trench. However, while Ukraine once enjoyed superiority in small drones for reconnaissance, that is no longer the case, as Russia has mobilized significant resources to acquiring fleets of them. So this is the idea that they've got a lot from China. These are crucial to SA when fighting to take or hold trenches. So a map from Brady Afric, and he's the one that's behind a lot of the trench mapping, helps show why everyone is throwing a kitchen sink at this one spot. It's only about 5.5 kilometers from this spot to the last fixed set lines in the Russian defense, and it is likely that the defenses were front loaded. So in other words, if we go back to your man here, what will be interesting to see is the distance. I don't know if I can do a distance here. Do a distance from there to here. So that's about 8 kilometers to the really the last major line, and then once you've broken through there, it's plain sailing. But you get my point. So things are getting closer. It depends where you are, of course. It's going to be a lot closer from that bend. So if they can clear it down to that bend, then it's not so far, and that's kind of what she's saying. Russia put the most effort into building up the first line and less from there. We know that the third and through the fifth aren't continuously manned. They're fallback positions, which brings up a big question: mines. Based on video evidence, the minefields in the first lines are incredibly dense, so much that the US Army doctrine would consider this density to be impassable or blocked for planning purposes. Russia has the ability to reseed minefields with artillery. However, Russia does not have an infinite amount of mines. They can reseed areas with mines on the fly, but not to this density level quickly. If Ukraine manages to clear the trenches around Verbovy, it is possible that things get easier going forward. Which brings me to how would I consider the offensive to be a success? And that really comes down to two things that need to happen before culmination. One, have they made it to the last line? Two, do they have enough left to prevent re-entrenchment? The goal is to get to some point where Ukraine finds an open backfield and Russia doesn't have more fixed fortifications and ultra-dense minefields to fall back on. Once Ukraine reaches a point like Romanivska, it almost doesn't matter where they choose to hit next. The midterm goal isn't to retake Tokmak or Melitopol, it's to sever Russian ground lines of communication between Rostov and Kherson, Zaporizhia, Crimea. If Ukraine gets through the fixed fortifications, they can have more options to continue south, hitting wherever Russia is weakest along the line. As long as Ukraine is advancing towards a highway between Berdyansk and Melitopol, they're making strategic gains, particularly as GLSDB, so ground-launched small diameter bombs that can be shot from HIMARS and other multiple launch rocket systems with a longer range than HIMARS, come online and holds more airfields, ports and rail lines at risk. The second part of this is that Ukraine needs to have enough ammunition, vehicles, people, fuel, etc. left to follow up on gains. This has been part of the debate between Washington and Kyiv. Ukraine has been loss averse since the initial assault. Every unit, vehicle, 155mm shell that you see penetrating lines is one that you don't have for the breakout attempt. The offensive is a failure if Ukraine gets past the last line, culminates, and then spends the winter watching Russia build new lines in front of them. In other words, let's go back to Perpetua's map. So once you get past here, if it's about getting to this Romanisca, for example, she says, once you get to there, like, there's no defenses behind there. But if you've fully culminated and you run out of ammunition and troops and you can't make further gains, then Russia will just spend a winter building up these kind of defenses again all the way back here. And it starts over again. It's just this continual attritional war that will not work to the favor of Ukraine. So if they get to here, they've got to have enough in the tank to still be able to push on. It doesn't have to be super quick because they'll have that ability to take out the ground lines of communication with distance munitions. But they still need to be sort of taking ground, increasing the salient. They still need to have enough left in the tank to do that. Otherwise, it's not good for the Ukrainians. So the Ukrainian dilemma is how much to spend getting through the lines and how much to hold back as they can exploit a potential breakthrough. Both are necessary, but not sufficient conditions. Inus conditions, J.L. Mackie, good old philosophical principle there. They must do both and plan for such. In summary, I believe we are seeing the most crucial moment in the offensive right now. Agreed. Russia has proved competent at falling back on defense. Agreed. However, as Ukraine advances into unprepared territory, the threat of mines decreases, reducing the worst barrier. Agreed. From this, we can infer how to measure success for either side. For Ukraine, I would say that a successful conclusion is very difficult, certainly not impossible either. And I think that's a great analysis. I'd be interested to see what you think. To be honest, it's stuff that we've already been talking about at some length and depth over the last few weeks. So that's nothing particularly new, but it kind of synthesizes it all, puts it all in one place. Hopefully that was of interest and use for you. It would have been a much shorter frontline update without that analysis. I hope that you appreciate that. Otherwise, I won't include that stuff like that in future. But anyway, take care. Thank you very much, and speak soon.